So what I'm presenting this morning is in some ways an early iteration of my next book, but also something that is building on some of the themes that I explored in my book, The Vanquished, but also in a number of edited collections, which I did with John Horn in particular, and also collaboratively with a number of people who are in this room today. So the ambition for me really is to kind of overcome what one might describe as a kind of historiographical nationalism when it comes to the subject of civil wars. People very often, when they write about civil wars, they think primarily about them within national contexts, which is not per se wrong, but we know relatively little about the peculiarities of civil wars unless, of course, we compare them to other instances of civil wars. And what I'm trying to do is to write civil wars in this period back into European history as one of the characteristic features of the lived experience of many Europeans in the first half of the 20th century. So this, as I said, follows on in some ways my ambition to connect the history of Ireland to that of other parts of Europe. And I think that this has been one very important aspect of the debates during the decade of centenaries, which has succeeded, in my view, in correcting some notions of national exceptionalism. Is this working? Sorry, can't see the screen. Here we are. So as historians of early 20th century Europe, myself included, we have been, for very good reasons, so focused on the two world wars as interstate conflicts that we have tended to downplay the centrality of intercommunity violence, which almost seems like a byproduct of the ideological conflicts that characterized what the historian Eric Hobsbawm famously called the Age of Extremes. Yet between 1914 and 1949, depending on what definition you use, Europe witnessed at least 30 civil wars, some of them more important than others or more significant than others. But really from Finland in the north to Ireland and Spain in the west, Ukraine and Russia in the east, and Greece and Italy in the south, very large parts of Europe experienced arguably the highest density of internal wars since the French Revolution. And what is interesting is that, as I said earlier on, that there is a sort of historiographical nationalism which didn't actually feature so prominently on the minds of people at the time. People at the time were actually connecting these incidents of civil war much more than people have done since. And for many contemporaries, these conflicts were related. Think, for example, of W.B. Yeats's most famous poem, The Second Coming, which, contrary to popular belief, is not primarily about Ireland. Its original working title, also Roy Foster assures me, was Reflections on the State of Europe. And so in many ways, the terrible beauty that he's writing about is not so much Irish nationalism, but it's really a combination of Bolshevism, the Great War, uncertainty about what exactly is going to happen in the world of politics. I also, in the UCD archives, quite recently came across a fascinating memo written by Kevin O'Shiel, who advised the government in January 1921 on the lessons to be learned for Ireland, January 1923, on the lessons to be learned from Russia and the Spartacist rising in Germany, and how these lessons could be applied to the Irish Civil War. And in essence, he was advising that despite the 34 executions that had taken place the previous month in Ireland, the measures weren't sufficient and had to be escalated in order to prevent precisely what had happened in Russia. So in today's lecture, what I'm hoping to explore is why Europe may have seen such a unique proliferation of civil wars, which were often fought not by regular armies, but indeed by paramilitaries, and very frequently targeted civilians, despite all international attempts to civilize warfare in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before I do that, let me just very briefly talk about the subject of civil wars itself, because it's such a contentious concept. It is obviously not something that has been ignored by historians. There are lots of books that have been written about how civil wars played out locally, including, of course, here in Cork. Civil wars, both in the period of the two world wars and beyond, have really been a thriving subject of historical research for the last 30 years, unquestionably propelled by the fact that civil war has become the most common form of armed conflict, much more common than interstate wars since 1945. If we think of Bosnia, Rwanda, Iraq to Somalia, from Syria to the Donbas region of embattled Ukraine since 2014, really from the 1990s onwards, civil wars have become the most dominant form of armed conflict. And nonetheless, it remains so controversial that there is no, this I think is quite telling in and of itself, there is no uncontentious definition of what a civil war is. The historian David Armitage has written a whole book about why that might be the case and why we find it so difficult, or have found it so difficult over the centuries, to arrive at a working definition of what a civil war is. So at the very sort of minimum technical level, you could define it as a conflict between at least two parties that were subject to the same authority, state authority, at the time when the conflict begins. But then, if you think about it, very often civil wars are fought between more than two parties. Very often there is significant international involvement. Think, for example, of Spain with the international brigades. Even here in Ireland, I mean, obviously there is the Anglo-Irish context in which it evolves. And so even these definitions have been subjected to scrutiny for some time. And in addition to that, civil wars are such a contentious subject because, unlike interstate wars, these conflicts very often take place within a community, very often between people who speak the same language. The debates about civil wars are very often dominated by questions about who started the civil war, which becomes a kind of circular debate, because depending on your own political views, there is no such thing as a kind of objectivity. And I think that makes the subject itself so complex, but at the same time also very interesting. So what I'm trying to do in the book is not really to rewrite European history in this period as a period that is solely dominated by civil wars, or indeed, as some historians have suggested, one extended European civil war between 1917 and 1945, something that had already been promoted by prominent contemporaries such as Charles de Gaulle or Winston Churchill in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and has since also been put forward by a variety of historians. Instead, I would argue, or want to make a case for a different argument, namely that Europe was at the epicenter of two interconnected cycles of civil war violence, one that lasted roughly from 1917 to 1923. We can debate those dates if you wish, and one that started in 1936 and ended in 1949 with the end of the Greek Civil War, which was the last civil war in Europe before the 1990s. And what is quite interesting, I think, is that as civil war kind of disappears from Europe's shores, it becomes a much more prominent theme in the non-European world. And I'll touch on that very briefly later on. And I think it's important to bear in mind that, of course, there's a strong ideological dimension to it, Bolshevism, anti-Bolshevism, and so on and so forth. But it is important to bear in mind that these cycles cannot simply be explained through a straightforward left-right divide. In fact, many of these civil wars were fought between fraternal enemies with origins in the same political camp. Ireland is a classic example of that, but not the only one. If you think of Germany, for example, where there is significant violence in the aftermath of the First World War in cities like Berlin or Munich. But the two sides that are fighting here originate from the same political camp, namely social democracy. So you have the independent social democrats on the one hand and the majority social democrats on the other. So what we're looking at are really quite complex conflicts in which one thing is very important and probably explains the nature of violence in civil wars, is that the concept of the internal enemy is very important. It's so closely connected to notions of betrayal, and that is very central to the logic of civil wars. While in most interstate wars, perhaps with the notable exception of the war that Nazi Germany waged against the Soviet Union, the purpose of such interstate wars is actually never to completely annihilate the enemy, but to force the opponent to accept certain terms of peace, however harsh. In civil wars, the logic is quite different. In civil wars, the purpose is always to completely destroy or permanently remove the opponent. Hence, what you find very often in the context of civil wars is that radical population policies such as partitions or expulsions are used as instruments that were originally designed to prevent the escalation of intercommunity violence into civil wars. So let me go back to my original question. How can we explain the proliferation of this particular kind of violence in the first half of the 20th century? I'd like to propose a number of sort of larger historical factors first. And I think one crucial factor here is the crisis of empire and disagreements about the future direction of politics and society. So if we kind of think back to Europe before the First World War, Europe is very much a continent that is dominated by empires, both land empires on the continent and the so-called blue water empires. And by the end of the conflict, many, or actually most of the land empires have disappeared. And that creates sort of spaces in which different political ambitions play out, in which state authority has been weakened, and very often these kind of conflicts play out in extremely violent ways. And you already see that happening before 1914 in the Balkans, for example, so in territories that were once part of the Ottoman Empire. And here in 1912, 1913, you have the so-called Balkan Wars, in which you see a massive proliferation of violence against minorities, in this case, Muslim minorities. And in addition to people who were either killed or forcibly were forced to convert to Christianity, there are about 300,000 Muslim refugees from the Balkans who basically move back into the Anatolian heartland of the Ottoman Empire. So you see the beginnings of kind of ethnic, religious violence unfolding, and this is a pattern that then happens in other parts of Europe as well. And already during the First World War, and often kind of covered up by that larger interstate conflicts, you have massive waves of ethnic violence happening. Just to give you two examples, in 1914, the Russian army invades Galicia, and very quickly the kind of multi-ethnic fabric of that particular part of the Habsburg Empire sort of unravels. First, so Galicia is, of course, now part of Ukraine, and it was at the time highly multi-ethnic. You had large Jewish communities, large small Muslim community, but mainly Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholics. And very quickly, this sort of unravels, and first the Orthodox minority is kind of singled out and very often killed. Subsequently, you have very large and significant massacres against the Jewish population there. Simultaneously, and this is perhaps a much better known case study, you have the Armenian genocide, which some scholars have actually described as a kind of Ottoman civil war, because the violence plays out between different subjects, Ottoman subjects, fighting we can discuss the usefulness of that concept, but what is important is that you everywhere in these multi-ethnic empires, you see the beginning of an unraveling of peaceful coexistence, and it playing out in extremely brutal ways. And what we're seeing in the First World War is kind of the beginning of a vicious cycle of ethnic revenge killings and racial engineering that only came to an end in the later 1940s with the mass expulsions of various minorities from their homelands. From 1917 onwards, however, you have an additional element that kind of fuels the fires of civil war. And that is, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which really kind of injects new dynamics into European politics and undoubtedly also kind of changes the logic of civil wars. Because what you have is not just extreme violence in Russia. The Russian Civil War is by far the biggest civil war in this period, but also kind of a spillover, if you like, because lots of people either feel inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, or it sort of is something that they want to avoid at all costs, even in countries where a Bolshevik takeover is unlikely. So what you see in the years between 1917 and 1923 is revolutionary and counter-revolutionary violence in places like Finland and Hungary, the Baltic states, Poland, and also parts of Germany, notably in Berlin and in Munich. And what makes the kind of violence so messy in this period is that you have a kind of overlap of different types that fed on each other. So you have kind of interstate violence, you have civil wars, but you also have revolutions, and it becomes quite messy. These conflicts are no longer fought between regular armies, but increasingly by paramilitary groups that try to fill the gap that has been left by the collapse of these land empires. And I think this context is quite important when we try to understand the massive waves of violence in this period. And as I said earlier on, it is very tempting, but I would say incorrect, to describe all this through a clear binary left-right divide. Instead, there are lots of examples where people sort of come from the same political background but disagree on the exact direction, future direction of the political entity and what these post-imperial states should look like. So interestingly enough, this very significant wave of violence sort of peters out by around 1923, giving way to a more stable post-war period. And as some people have pointed out, the only civil wars that kind of begin between in that period, or that are still ongoing, are the ones in Ireland and in Spain. Otherwise, it is largely a period in which civil war seems to disappear. What does not disappear is a kind of a culture of armed politics or uniformed politics, a transition from armies to armbands, as Martin Conway has put it quite well, I think. And obviously the origins of that kind of go back to the period between 1917 and 1923. So you see shirted movements emerging everywhere in Europe, and they actually look quite similar. All these kind of, you think of Italy, for example, fascist movements, you think about the SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi party, but also in other countries where political parties wear uniforms and wear armbands to basically occupy public spaces, and to often do that without violence, but then from the mid-1930s onwards, again, kind of resorting to violence, undoubtedly propelled by the economic transformations triggered by the Great Depression after 1929. So physical violence really returns and massively escalates in the mid-1930s, notably, of course, in Spain, from 1936 onwards, but then also, and even more importantly, after 1939, when in the shadow of the Second World War, you see all these kind of different conflicts erupting between people who decide for whatever reason to collaborate with the occupiers, people who decide to resist. So you have this simmering violence beneath the Great War, which I think is quite important to understand the dynamics and the total nature of the Second World War, without which I think it's difficult to explain, because even if you look at the Nazi occupation, which is terrible and oppressive, but for example, in the persecution of the Jews, very often the Nazis have to rely on people who speak the language, who know where the Jewish communities are living. Because there are relatively few Germans who speak Lithuanian or Greek, for example. So they have to rely quite heavily on local collaborators who collaborate for various reasons, not because they particularly like the Nazis, because Nazi ideology is so overtly focused on German interests that it's quite difficult to sign up for that. But nonetheless, they have their own kind of local reasons why they decide to do that, or conversely, why they decide to resist the Nazis. So below that level of Nazi occupation and the fighting of the big armies, you have this sort of ongoing conflict even in France or in Italy, which I think helps us to better understand the nature of violence in this period. And interestingly enough, after the end of the Greek Civil War, which we can discuss in greater detail if you wish, but that ends in 1949, interestingly enough, unlike the Chinese Civil War, which is going on simultaneously, that ends with a communist victory. The Greek one ends with a communist defeat. And really, after that, kind of civil wars no longer play an important role in European history, except, of course, in the North, which, of course, you could define the Troubles as a form of low-intensity civil war that is ongoing. And then, of course, in the 1990s, you have the conflicts also in former Yugoslavia. So that's kind of the larger picture, if you like, of what is happening in Europe in this period. And what we're trying to do with a larger project in UCD at the moment is not just to compare these different incidents of violence, but also to look for connections between them. And here I just want to give you a few kind of examples. Sorry, I think I missed one here. Yeah, so what connects these different civil wars? And I think there are a number of ways of looking at this. One is what I call kind of securocrats, and securocrats are people who increasingly specialize in how to fight civil wars, how to police civil wars, how to win civil wars. And one interesting case here is Charles Wickham, who of course was head for a very long time of the RUC in Belfast. He increasingly becomes a sort of specialist in civil wars. He previously had been part of the Allied intervention in Russia, and then after 1945 goes to Greece as the the head of the British police mission in Athens, advising the Greek government on how to fight and win the civil war that had just started there. Then you also have a number of quite interesting German officers, ex-German officers, like Hans von Seeckt, who was chief of staff of the German army. He goes to China and advises Chiang Kai-shek on how to win the civil war, for example. You've got people like Ernst Röhm, who, of course, becomes head of the SA, but he spends quite some time in Bolivia, trying again to advise people on how to kind of fight wars. And I think that's an interesting way of connecting it, which of course begs the question then whether the story that I'm trying to tell is European in nature or whether it's actually global, because at the beginning of my period here, you also have a major civil war, of course, in Mexico, which simmers for a very long time, and then at the end of it in China. But I think these two are actually exceptions, whereas within Europe, in this period, you have a very high density of civil war. So while I'm very open to the idea that, my Europe has is porous to a certain extent, that's the main focus of what I'm currently trying to write about. There's also another kind of, apart from that, you also were looking at kind of humanitarians who are involved in different conflicts and who sort of learn different lessons from the different civil wars in which they are involved. But also journalists. I'm quite interested, for example, in this man, Francis McCullough, also Northern Irish, who is a very influential war correspondent in the first half of the 20th century, who writes about, he's in Russia, for example, during the Civil War. He's also then moves back to Ireland to report for various international newspapers about the Irish Civil War, then goes to Spain in the 1930s. Becomes increasingly kind of conservative, but when you think about the images that are generated about civil war, it is quite intriguing to see that it's really a handful of journalists, of war correspondents, that are determining what people read about civil wars. And usually it's the same people writing that, using similar images. And you can actually say the same thing about people like Wickham, for example. If you read his situation reports that he sends back to London, it's quite intriguing that he compares the situation quite explicitly in Greece at the time with the situation in Northern Ireland, very often kind of saying, well, you know, these are the Protestants and these are the Catholics, and can we use the same strategies to kind of pacify the situation here, which is what he's doing. And so in these people's minds, there are connections which I think for a very long time we've ignored, and which we're trying to explore in the project that I'm currently looking at. So to come to an end, what we're primarily interested in is to connect different experiences of civil wars in Europe at the time. I feel quite strongly that that will help us in many ways to better understand what is peculiar about the Irish case, but also the Spanish case, the Greek case, because what is happening at the moment is that we're assuming peculiarity. It's unproven. We always say, well, yeah, but the Spanish case is different, the Irish case is different. But when you then say, well, how is it different? Can we kind of qualify that or quantify that? Then it becomes trickier, I think, and therefore we're sort of hoping not to ignore peculiarity, because I'm sure that each civil war has very peculiar aspects, but to make clearer and more visible what these peculiarities are and what common threads might exist between them. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions, if indeed you have any. Thank you very much.
Civilian deaths in the island of Ireland in 1922 and 23 didn't occur in what we call the Irish Civil War.
Yep.
They occurred in what is not termed at all a civil war, primarily in Belfast. Mm-hmm. Yep. Right? Mm-hmm. And the deaths on both sides are largely the responsibility not of the British Army, not even of the regular police, but respectively of the IRA, of armed civilians, and of the Special Constabulary, who effectively are, an armed militia rather than a disciplined. Charles Wickham himself held forth about the problem of the Special Constabulary later on to MI5 and other organisations. So I'm just wondering, definitionally, if we're looking at civil war in Ireland in 22, 23, surely we have to be insular rather than national, rather than partitionist, because most civilians in those two, most targeted civilians who die in those 2 years die not in the 26 counties, but they die in the north, and they die overwhelmingly not because they're hit by a bullet outside the forecourts, as happened during the Civil War down here, but because they're killed because of the group they're perceived to belong to. So I think in Ireland we have a problem with kicking off the Civil War on the 28th of June 22, because that means all the violence that occurs both parts of the island before that date somehow doesn't count, and therefore doesn't get mapped onto other people's conflicts, which we call civil wars. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I was always quite intrigued by that sort of partitionist view of Irish history, which kind of very frequently you find reference to Cork as being the most violent place in the period, when clearly it's Belfast, right? It's kind of been written out of it. And I'm really interested in what is happening in Northern Ireland at the time, and I think Wickham is fascinating, but so is his staff, because most of he takes 40 officers with him to to Athens initially. Most of them are Northern Irish Catholics, isn't that? I find that quite interesting in and of itself, and very loyal to him. But certainly Northern Ireland and Belfast plays a very central role in all of this. I mean, there are other examples. It's not just Wickham, but I think I just picked Wickham out as sort of being representative of. It would be very easy to find, French, German, Italian counterparts to him. But in recent years, people have become quite interested in these kind of networks, and a few books have been published of late on imperial officers who sort of, whenever there is an atrocity, it's the same people kind of popping up time and again around the globe, and I'm quite fascinated by that. But yeah, absolutely, 100% I agree with you about the centrality of Northern Ireland and Belfast and how that needs to be written into the history of the Irish Civil War, but also any European history of civil war. I think we'll have to pay due attention to the North. Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Stradling's work on the Irish in the Spanish Civil War, but he suggests that it was a continuation of the Irish Civil War by stealth. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering your opinion on that. And also in terms of Ireland itself, you mentioned how in civil wars it's the getting rid of those who are in conflict with you. But in the Irish Civil War, once peace had been restored, it brings in those who are in opposition, or most of them, into the political process and facilitates them. And I'm wondering what your comments on that would be.
I've long been interested in Irish volunteers on both sides, of course, in the Spanish Civil War. Of course, many of them are kind of the volunteers who fight for Franco. Briefly, they don't stay very long, but they do that because they view the Republicans or part of the Republican camp as Bolsheviks who try to undermine or abolish altogether the Catholic Church. So that would be kind of the dominant driver for volunteers on that side, whereas the others are coming out of trade union backgrounds and so on and so forth. And Bolshevism, of course, never really played a major role here in Ireland. I mean, there were fantasies about it, but apart from the very short-lived Limerick Soviet, I think there are relatively few references, and it is worth bearing in mind that the Irish Republican revolutionaries were actually very conservative on both sides, and socially and culturally and politically. In terms of your second question was about removing the enemy from the... Yeah, I mean, my reference here was primarily to... So, for example, there are obviously different grades of intensity. If you look at it, I mean, my argument would be that partition, expulsions, genocides are all responses to the same perceived questions, but with different intensity, obviously. The idea is, when you look at genocide, is to completely once and for all remove the perceived other from the community by killing them. And partition, for example, tries to achieve that without the same level of violence. It is an answer to the same perceived issue. You separate the communities out in order to prevent them from killing each other. Now, partition has never worked anywhere where it was used, whereas if you look at European history, expulsions have been more successful in appeasing communities. If you look at, for example, the very significant expulsions of Germans from East Central Europe after the end of the Second World War, that was the end to territorial revisionism. Of course, there's a Cold War context to this as well. But up until that point, and that was kind of recognized by policymakers, that the key problem was that there was, on the one hand, an ambition to create ethnically homogeneous states. On the other hand, however, at least on the European continent, that didn't really exist. So how do you deal with that situation? How do you kind of establish a situation in which they stop killing each other? And therefore, you could say that in some ways, the partition is one answer to a commonly perceived problem.
Thank you very much. I'm fascinated by the amount of effort you've put into the interconnection of various movements and reactions throughout Europe over a considerable period of very difficult times. I just wondered if your exploration had looked in any way at whether there was a connection between those roots of civil unrest and violence over that period and current drifts in political attitude in Europe. I'm fascinated to try and track any historic as well as political reason for the apparent drift towards right-wing extreme politics in Europe. I just wondered if you'd explore that at all.
Not yet, but I think it's a fascinating question to look at. I mean, if you look at some countries like Hungary, for example, Hungary is still obsessed, actually, very much with the period that I'm talking about in terms of Trianon Treaty, revisionism in terms of populations, very large, significant numbers of Hungarians still live outside of the Hungarian borders, for example. So you can still use these issues to mobilize people to vote for nationalist parties. I mean, the situation would be different, but one can also look at connections between this period in history and the present. If you look at the Baltic states, for example, I think if you want to try to understand their attitude towards Russia, I think you have to look at their historical experiences across the 20th century. But there's also an interesting and I think worrying revisionism in relation to how they perceive, for example, volunteers who fought for the Waffen-SS in the Second World War were suddenly seen or perceived as heroes because they already understood at the time in the nationalist reading, they understood at the time that the real enemy was Russia and that the danger would always come from Russia. And they didn't fight for the Nazis because they supported National Socialism. So that's a kind of revisionist narrative, which is once again very popular actually in nationalist camps in the Baltic states today and is deeply worrying. So in some parts of the world, and Ukraine is another, I think, very good example, this history that I've been talking about today is still extremely relevant, either as real history or because it sort of informs politics, or there's a performative element to it where people always go back to at the end of the First World War is the first moment, of course, of Ukrainian independence. So this is a moment that is referred to time and again, and one could say is in some ways even more important than the Second World War, really, because short-lived Ukrainian independence was taken away by Russia, and that sort of started a tradition of Russian governments doing this and trying to undermine Ukrainian independence time and again. So I think it's a very important historical reference point for a lot of these revisionist debates that are happening, particularly in East Central Europe.
Thank you very much for that. If you took one country, it just seems to me at the moment, if you just concentrated on Spain for a moment and looked at its history up to the present day, political history, is there something endemic in the ebb and flow of political attitude which profoundly affects situations like the one in Spain from the period you talked about at the beginning to today?
Well, Spain has, of course, understandably long been obsessed by the experience of the Civil War and the divisions. I would say that populism, there's another element, of course, to the rise of populism today, and that's something that we cannot really connect back to this period, which is migration. Migration is propelling, for example, the migration crisis is propelling populism in several European countries, including in Germany, where the AfD is a party that very much sort of moved away from being an EU critical party to one that had really a single issue in relation to stopping migration and avoiding a situation where you have more, particularly Muslim migrants, sort of moving. And I think if I understand it correctly, I'm not following the debates within Spain as closely, but I think the renewed kind of strength of parties like Vox owe a lot to that rather than to questions related to the Spanish Civil War, even though there were very significant public debates about the internment of Franco, for example, a couple of years ago, and what to do with kind of how to come to a point where you can have an integrated commemoration of the victims of the Spanish Civil War. A couple of years ago, I was invited to a conference in Valencia, and what I found really interesting is that there are still segregated memorials to nationalists and Republicans all over the place. And so they haven't really found a way of integrating the memory of the Spanish Civil War. It's undoubtedly a cause for heated debates, but I wouldn't necessarily say that this is what explains the rise of populism today. I think that would be,
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, thank you for the interesting talk, and it sounds like you're doing really fascinating work at UCD and trying to bring all these things together. But one thing that struck me in your talk was, to me, the conspicuous absence of the word nationalism, because isn't one of the unifying forces in all of these civil wars is who gets to define the nation within these new states? I mean, there's no emperor, there's no king, there's no sultan to whom people could look as the unifier. And so now, it's these Enlightenment ideas and of the people deciding, but which people, of course? And you can apply that, of course, to Northern Ireland with the Unionists. They are nationalists within a UK context, and then suddenly they're being told, no, we're not. Or meanwhile, of course, or down in the South, you have a situation obviously very different where Dev is defining Irish nationalism along Irish, Gaelic and Catholic lines, whereas unionism is defined more on British and Protestant lines. And you can take this throughout Europe, of course, in all these cases. So isn't nationalism really the kind of glue that at least holds together so many of these different civil wars?
Absolutely. I mean, I was talking about ethnicity, sort of, and obviously the national question is a different one in these hugely diverse Central European ex-imperial territories, where you have different projects. You have nationalist projects, and then, of course, different groups define the national project in very different ways, often in incompatible ways. And I would say one of the sources of conflicts is that many of these kind of post-imperial states in East Central Europe like to think of themselves as ethnically homogenous, but they're really the exact opposite. They're just as ethnically diverse as the imperial predecessor from which they originate. So you have absolutely ethnicity, religion, nationalism as sources of conflict, but then of course you have transnational projects like Bolshevism, which of course defines itself not as a national project primarily, but wants to achieve a global revolution. And Lenin becomes slightly less ambitious as he realizes that, but the ambition is very much initially that they want the revolution to move westwards, and particularly, of course, to Germany, which is what Marx was really kind of thinking about. And Russia not being a fully industrialized state sort of set not too well with Marxist theory, so it had to be adopted by Lenin going forward. So you have nationalism, then these transnational projects, and under the umbrella of nationalism, you have different either ethnic or religious kind of conflicts that very much stem from the fact, as you say, that people, it's not quite clear who gets to define what the future of the state might look like. And how do minorities fit into that? Which is why I think one of the best things to come out of the Paris Peace Conference was, of course, the minorities treaties that at least try to force these new states to acknowledge that they have minorities and give them an opportunity to sue their states if their rights are violated. So that is one way of trying at least to find a solution, a non-violent solution to this multi-ethnicity, multi-religious entities.
Assuming defined itself as an anti-nationalist state.
Yeah, and colorblind when it comes to ethnicity. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm sitting in front of the curious case, and I can't. I think you said you were fascinated by the journalist that covers wars. I think he covered more than war.
Oh, yeah,
Can you
yes.
tell us a little bit more about him?
Sure. So he starts off his career. I think he's initially a correspondent in East Asia, and his kind of career as a war correspondent really begins with the outbreak of the Russian-Japanese War. So he, by coincidence or not, finds himself on a warship in Port Arthur during the attacks, and really becomes involved in sort of one of the first embedded journalists. He travels with the Ottoman army already during the Balkan Wars, and then during the First World War, he becomes again an embedded journalist with Venizelos, the Greek troops in the Thessaloniki front, and then returns to Russia during the revolution. He's one of the very few foreign correspondents who's there, rather miraculously kind of convinces the Bolsheviks that he's not a British spy, which he is, and he interviews some of the leading Bolsheviks then at the time, and that's really when his star begins to rise. There's, I think, even in the New York Times, he does a piece, New York Herald, yeah, he does a piece for an interview with a man who killed the Tsar, which is really quite fascinating. So he finds this guy in Ekaterinburg who ironically now sells life insurances or something like that. And then he comes back to Ireland and writes about the Irish Civil War for international press, and then goes to Mexico, which of course is still sort of recovering from its own civil war. He's increasingly perceived, quite rightly, as very right-wing and anti-Bolshevik, which appeals to certain readers but not to others. And he's getting kind of, yeah, also age-wise, he's getting on, but he does cover the Spanish Civil War, but not every paper wants to buy it because he's so biased towards Franco.
Is he wearing a uniform in this photograph? Which one is he?
Sorry, he is to the far right.
Yeah, what's he wearing?
He is there as with the British, the Allied intervention in Siberia, and then basically stays in Russia as they leave and kind of interviews people. So very fascinating character. He's from Oman originally, and yeah, I think he could definitely do a Netflix series on him alone, because he is sort of a kind of, yeah, he pops up everywhere, you know, wherever there's a conflict, he's there. And he's very short-sighted, which is interesting. So, yeah, he's just a very fascinating figure. But there are others like him. But if you look at, I mean, the war correspondents really kind of become a thing, of course, with the two world wars. And then, of course, we know a lot because of Hemingway and others about, you know, the Spanish Civil War. But lots of these people then kind of become professional sort of Civil War journalists. Of course, they cover other conflicts as well. But I think it's interesting just to kind of look at how certain images are transported of civil wars. And the same is actually true for photographers. Like, there are people who become increasingly specialized in shooting pictures of Civil War situations, which is why when you look at images of different civil wars, they kind of look similar. And quite often it's because it's the same people taking the shots with the same camera and projecting certain ideas of what a civil war might look like onto the next conflict. So I think it's quite interesting in terms of the circulation of knowledge about these kinds of conflicts. And we're looking at a group that is not particularly large, that kind of generates these images and projects them through newspaper articles. And we have to bear in mind that in those days, the Associated Press, for example, is very important because lots of newspapers then take their short articles, and McCullough writes for AP, among others. So his articles are really kind of have a global ramification, which makes them even more interesting.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you have a view on this, how much a civil war actually is what I call the evolution of the revolution. You mentioned in your talk, at the beginning of your talk, how ideologically both sides of the Civil War are on their respective views of what they're doing. And how it then ends up with othering somebody, the Jews, the ethnic cleansing, something of that nature. And my question arises from, in Europe particularly, it seems to me a lot of it was revolutions where imperial powers were either coming to an end or were overthrown, something of that nature, and that was the goal everybody had. Yeah. Subsequently, though, the Civil War occurs, and I wonder then how much, in fact, the Civil War actually is simply, now that they've achieved their objective, as it were, is now a question of who is going to rule the roost, as it were, who's going to be the dominant faction. And particularly in Europe, in the early part of the 20th century, which is what you're talking about. And Ireland, I think, is an example of that. It was an imperial war, if you like, over from the middle of the 19th century, the land wars and so on and so forth. And the extreme example of that would be outside Europe now, just to throw it out there, is Ortega in Central America, for example.
Yep. No, thank you very much. I mean, I agree with you that in this period, what is, I think, fascinating is that you have an overlap of different types of revolutions. You have national revolutions, but you also have sort of revolutions that aim for social transformation. And these two, where these two kind of overlap, you usually have the most significant escalation of violence. For a revolution to turn into a civil war, what you do need is, at least initially, you need a certain level of symmetry between these two forces. Otherwise, the dominant group would put down the other group very quickly, and then it doesn't really become a civil war. So I think symmetry, at least initially, is quite important, so that you have two camps that are roughly similar. And then it also, I mean, depends on the kind of revolution that you're looking at. I think Carl Schmitt once wrote something really interesting about civil wars when he tried to define what that is. I mean, he's obsessed with civil war and how to kind of prevent it. And he writes that civil wars are conflicts between two sides that each categorically denies that the other side is part of the same community. Which I think is very clever, actually, because and that kind of also explains why they want to ideally remove the other side from the equation in one way or another. Because if they're not part of the community, then they have to go somewhere else, right? And either they do that by fleeing somewhere else, or through violence, or through expulsions, etc. So I think that helps us better to explain why some revolutions lead to civil wars and others don't. But I agree with you that very often they are preceded by a revolutionary moment of one kind or another. And that kind of helps, I think, to understand that there is an interconnectedness between revolutions and also between and civil wars. Is that? Yeah?
The last question here.
Tied up a bit with what you've already said, but two very quick questions. You can give quick answers to them, but what is the key to a successful country? And how does that country challenge the rise of extreme nationalism dressed up as populism? And the other one is, with the benefit of hindsight, how could you gain separation from the rest of the United Kingdom for a whole island of Ireland and all its people without the use of conflict?
Mm-hmm. Big questions, yeah. I could probably make a lot of money if I had answers to
and
it.
And also avoiding partition. How would you have done that 100 years ago, reflecting back with the benefit of hindsight?
How would I have
done that, reflecting
partition.
Back? How would you have gained separation from the rest of the United Kingdom for the whole island of Ireland without partition happening and avoiding conflict? And the other is, what is the key to a successful country, and how do you counter the rise of extreme nationalism, which is dressed up as populism and uses very populist methods to actually gain its achievement or seeking to achieve power?
And Robert, you have about 90 seconds, so probably...
this may be a condensed answer.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously big questions and very hard to kind of give you a formula for a successful political entity. But I mean, by and large, and at the risk of simplifying things, I think you can make an argument, and you look at various kind of conflict situations across the 20th century, not just Ireland. I mean, obviously, one key to success is economic prosperity, because suddenly people, you see there's a direct correlation between the rise of economic prosperity and a decrease in nationalism, because people care about other things, to be honest with you. And I think you can see that in Ireland as well. So I think if you manage to solve the economic issues in the north, that would probably go a long way towards diffusing a situation, because a lot of it is, of course, propelled by, I mean, if you take the subsidies from London away, the situation is not great. And I think, that is often not something that enters the political debate here about unification. Like who's going to pay? And I'm saying that as a German who is still, my parents are still paying tax for German reunification 30 years later. It's called the solidarity tax, and it's 5%. And I think those are. I think I'm just saying that economic prosperity, I think, goes a long way, and Germany is another excellent example for that, for the decrease in nationalism and revisionist ambition over the course of the 20th century. But I'm sure there are much better, much more complex answers to this particularly complex question. So sorry if I can't solve it for you right now.
Robert, I'm conscious that we began 20 minutes late. You have answered many questions, and I think you've set a framework for a conversation that will continue. And you will be on the panel tomorrow morning of academic historians, which is just as good. I'm insisting on parity of esteem for panels, notwithstanding what was said in response to my comments yesterday. But Robert, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed. Thanks.